Welcome everyone to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Bitronistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. We are a movement of more than 20,000 people, including many reserve officers and operators from all branches of the Israel Defense establishment. Thank you so much to all of our viewers and supporters for joining this briefing. It's a great privilege for us to be able to come to you with this analysis and really behind the headlines. It's been a very difficult day here in Israel with what is going on in this war. And we're going to begin, of course, with an update from the founder and chairman of IDSF, Brigadier General Amir Avivi. General, please.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Indeed, a very difficult 24 hours. We had 24 soldiers that were killed, 3 officers of the paratroopers who were killed in a big attack that Division 98 launched in Khan Yunis. In this attack, the division surrounded completely Khan Yunis and are closing more and more on the heart of where we assume that Sinwar and death and probably many hostages are. Basically, there are now 4 brigades closing on a very dense area in Khan Yunis and managing to really kill many terrorists. But RPG hit a house where our soldiers were, and as a consequence, 3 officers were killed. In the center of Gaza, we are creating a perimeter of 1 kilometer from the border in, and we are destroying all the infrastructure and houses in this area. There was a reserve battalion of infantry that were preparing 2 houses to explode them, and there was a RPG that was shot at the house and it created an explosion, and unfortunately many soldiers were killed because the houses collapsed on them. I talked to the chief of combat engineers to really try to understand professionally what can be done to carry out these missions in a way that will be less dangerous for the soldiers, but it's something that they will have to really go into details and see what they can do about that. In the north, we're continuing to attack Hezbollah position. That Hezbollah is also attacking along the border, mainly trying to hit our center of command of the overall Air Force picture that we see in the north. And we also see on the regional level the US with the Britain more and more involved in attacking Houthi positions. In the last day, 8 attacks on the Houthis, trying to really prevent from them to affect the trade along the Red Sea. And I think that probably this will continue and grow. They have really launched an ongoing operation in this area. So I would say definitely a difficult day, but we have to understand we are continuing to attack fiercely every day. Hamas capabilities are diminishing more and more. Every day we're moving towards the destruction of Hamas. I think the work is very professional. This week I had the chance to speak with the Dan Goldfuss, the commander of the 98th Division, the paratroopers who is commanding the 7 brigades in Khan Yunis. And I was very impressed by how confident he is, how professionally they're working. And I think the most interesting thing was that the IDF has learned in these 3 months to really be effective in operating and fighting inside the tunnels. This is something that 3 months ago I don't think they even considered seriously to go underground and actually fight in the tunnels. But this is exactly what the IDF is doing now. And it's doing it in a very, very efficient way. They develop techniques and capabilities and technology to go underground, to overcome booby traps, to overcome improvised explosive devices, to overcome heavy blast doors that are along the corridors inside the tunnels, to be able to kill terrorists inside tunnels that are doing it on everyday basis and move safely in the tunnels. We uncovered the tunnel this week that we know that they were keeping like 20 hostages in this tunnel. And they managed to kill all the terrorists inside the tunnel, overcome all the obstacles, and reach the point where the hostages were. In this case, there were no hostages, but this gives a very good idea of what's coming. The IDF will continue to fight underground and above ground until they reach the leadership of Hamas, until they reach the hostages. Israel tried to suggest maybe a ceasefire of a month, even more, to get more hostages released, but Hamas refuses. This means that we are not yet endangering them enough. The IDF is assessing that in like 3-4 weeks, the Khan Yunis brigade of Hamas will be completely destroyed. So they are moving forward. The fighting is fierce, but overall, I think that things are done in a very good way. A lot of confidence in the forces, and I hope that they keep really safe and careful in the way they operate. Elie.
General Avivi, thank you very much. My name is Elie Pierpz, and I serve as the International Director for Israel Defense Security Forum. And one of the things that I wanted to speak with you about is definitely some of the work that we've been doing in general, internationally and diplomatically. But especially, I wanted to bring you to a case study, something that just happened last week in Europe that I don't know if maybe you followed it or if you are familiar. Because normally when you, and frankly when I think of Europe diplomatically concerning Israel, the result is usually not very good, maybe even a punchline. But what we saw last week was that Israel received actually a very positive treatment in the European Parliament, and that wasn't what was expected to happen. The European Parliament passed a resolution which was originally designed to pressure Israel into agreeing to a premature ceasefire and support the main Hamas points. Instead, the parliament made some changes to that resolution that completely altered and changed the meaning of the resolution, so that it now essentially supported Israel's declared war goals. It was a complete 180-degree turn, and something that I think bodes very well, and it's something that I do think that is valuable to walk through what happened, what IDF's role was, that will help to demonstrate and hopefully give some hope that there, even though we constantly are seeing a lot of negative stuff diplomatically, the Red Cross, UN, etc., that are constantly attacking Israel. Just last week we were brought before the ICJ. There's plenty of negativity out there, but despite that, there are some positive developments that I think is important for you to be aware of. The first thing is the Israeli government did a phenomenal job in the days after October 7th in facilitating for world leaders to visit the Gaza envelope in the days and weeks after October 7th. Pretty much every major country sent either a prime minister, a defense minister, a foreign minister that really allowed them to see what happened, get emotionally invested, and understand and provided the prime minister, the defense minister, and even as the war cabinet was getting put together, gave them the ability to set expectations that this was going to be a very different Israeli response. This was going to be a very different Israeli war, and that Israel itself had fundamentally changed from October 6th to October 8th. It's a different country. Now, remains to be seen whether Israel continue that way, but at least for the last few months, Israel has been operating at a slightly different and hopefully a more aggressive and a more security-oriented approach. The second thing is really what we've been doing at IDSF. It's really about the last year or so, we've been spending a good amount of time developing and building relations with Europe. In fact, it just turned out that 2 weeks before October 7th, General Avivi was invited to testify before the Italian parliament on the havoc that Iranian proxies have been causing in the region and why that is direct threat to, in that case, Italy. And how potentially could lead to mass migration of Arabs to Europe. His testimony focused specifically on the Houthis and how the Houthis and how Iranian proxies were strategically located at now a place that people are familiar with, Bab al-Mandeb, the area, the straits right near Yemen. And Iran had also invested very heavily in the Polisario, another Iranian proxy group, which has been threatening Morocco, close to the Straits of Gibraltar, again, with an ability to hamper and harm world trade. That was something that General Avivi said when he was testifying before the Italian parliament. It was between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, literally just days before October 7th. This was a message that we had brought to DC. General Avivi had been in DC multiple times throughout 2023. We spoke about that in many cases. I remember actually describing and showing what Bab al-Mandeb was. People were not always familiar with that, but letting them know what the Houthis are, things of that sort. And that when what we saw start happening this year over the last few months, there was an awakening that we have been on top of it. We understand the dynamics. We understand the potential geopolitical implications and how it could impact both the US, Europe, and the whole world. And that's something that has built us and given us a lot of credibility. Fast forward to November, we were asked to go to Brussels, which is the headquarters of the European Parliament. So General Avivi and I went. We met with multiple, and just for a little bit of background, in the European Parliament, there are 705. It's called MEPs, members of the European Parliament. They come from 27 different countries. We obviously didn't meet with all of them, but we met with quite a few from a range of countries, from a range of political parties. I think it was 6 or 7 political parties from the right to the left altogether. And it's something that I think is extremely valuable because they had not really heard. They'd heard from government officials and from the embassy, but not from people with the level of tactical military experience, geopolitical experience that General Avivi brought. After that trip, we followed up with many different requests from them remotely, some by Zoom, some just conversations, asking for policy papers and explanations of different issues that were coming up that they were not that familiar with. And it culminated with, on January 14th, on a Sunday, we got a call saying that there was going to be an effort by 3 very left-wing, very anti-Israel members of parliament who were going to try to put together a resolution, not a law, but a resolution that was going to try to put pressure on Israel to prematurely enter into a ceasefire with Hamas. It didn't seem like there was much that we could do. That's what we were told. But we went ahead and we reached out to some of our allies, and they asked us if we could come up with some recommendations of things that they could use both in their arguments and potentially they could use in their actual recommendations of amendments to the resolution. What ended up happening was there were about 4, I'm not going to go through all of them, but there were 4 parts of the resolution that they ended up taking pretty much word for word from what we said. They actually, the European Parliament is not very democratic. They have not even released the exact language of what was voted upon. So we do have it, but it's not been released publicly yet. But the first thing was we weren't able to have them stop calling for a ceasefire, but we got them to change the language so that it says the calls for a permanent ceasefire and to restart efforts toward a political solution provided that all the hostages are immediately and unconditionally released, and the terrorist organization Hamas is completely dismantled. So that was language that was not anticipated, certainly by those who had introduced the resolution initially. But once we were able to present this as potential language, not just to parties who are historically a little bit more sympathetic to Israel, but even to parties who are not sympathetic to Israel, they thought this was a very acceptable and something they really could not oppose. They went ahead and they also added in language that particularly called out Hamas leaders accumulated huge wealth at the expense of the Palestinian civilians who are living mostly in poverty. They condemned the strikes by Lebanon and urged the reinstatement of or the compliance with UN Resolution 1701, which would require Hezbollah and any armed entity that's adjacent to Israel's northern border to retreat between 20 to 40 kilometers back to the Litani River. And then on top of that, they also took in a little pot shot at Qatar. They denounced any countries, non-state entities that provided financial support to Hamas, to Hezbollah, and particularly mentioned Qatar. You might be familiar that Qatar, there's what's known as Qatargate in Europe right now because they bribed many European officials, and there are a lot of court cases going on right now regarding Qatar. They hosted the World Cup this past year, and it was done through illegal manners, and that they bribed a lot of officials. So a lot of Europeans have a lot of anger towards Qatar. So there was an opportunity there to follow up and pummel Qatar a little bit. What I wanted you to see, I would then make us get to the result, the vote. Out of 705 voting members, only 515 participated. Not everybody was around. This vote took place in Strasbourg in France, not in Brussels, so not everybody attends. But with 312 votes in favor, and again, that means in favor of they want a ceasefire on the condition that Hamas is completely dismantled and all of the hostages are returned. The vote was 312 in favor, 131 against, with 72 formally abstaining. And then the other 190 did not were not in Brussels or not in Strasbourg at the time. This is now seen certainly in Israel as a very significant diplomatic achievement. We normally do not get positive results out of Europe. We did get some positive results out of Europe. We got Europe on the record, and the leaders of Europe who are continuing to put pressure on Israel are having a difficult time resolving themselves to the fact that their official body has gone ahead and said the only way Israel should agree to a ceasefire is if Hamas is completely dismantled. And all of the hostages are returned, two things that Hamas is obviously dead set against. So essentially, while this was a vote for a ceasefire, the reality was it was a vote that Europe is supporting Israel's war efforts and war goals of dismantling Hamas and also going ahead and getting our hostages back. With that, we aren't exclusively focused on Europe. We spend a lot of time in the States. So far, our relations in the States are such that we have been doing weekly calls with congressional staff. We have very good relationships and communication with members of Congress. So we're able to help out and provide guidance and provide our expertise remotely. That is something that we might be able to do. We might have to go into DC at some point. But for now, we've been all able to do almost everything remotely. And I see we have a lot of friends. Clearly, Israel has a lot of enemies. And the layout in DC is getting more complicated for Israel. It's definitely is more challenging, particularly on the Democratic side. And Israel needs to continue to engage. But ultimately, Israel also needs to make it clear to our allies, even to our allies, that there are times that Israel is going to have to go its own way. And we have to be able to withstand international pressure. So far, Israel has largely been doing that. Certainly, there are things that we maybe would have wanted Israel to do slightly differently, but it's not something. It's not something that's very easy to just break off. There are significant benefits that Israel gets from the cooperation, or showing the appearance of cooperation with our allies, both in Europe and in the U.S. And I don't expect a significant change, but I do expect that IDSF to continue to have a significant impact on the diplomatic our diplomatic activities in an informal capacity remotely. Then in Israel, we also obviously work very closely with all the ambassadors who are based here. We did a briefing just last week on our plans for not just the day after Gaza or this war, but really the generation after the war, the next gen, as we like to call it. And was a very interesting and engaging discussion. And that's something that we'll be covering a little bit at our conference next week, which I believe sure Moshe has spoken about. With that, I don't know if there's any other questions, but yeah, I'll leave it from there.
Elie, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And it just goes to show that IDSF is not a think tank, but we are really actively impacting policy on a global level, and a large part of that is to you. So thank you so much. We have a little bit of time for some questions. So first off, in terms of the two-state solution, to what extent does an insistence on the two-state solution impact Israel's relations with Europe?
It's definitely is an issue. I will say that even in the resolution that that was passed, the resolution does call for a two-state solution. Obviously, we're not supportive of that. It's something that now is everybody just says. What we need and what's beginning to happen is that a lot of the leaders are beginning to become more and more suspect of what a two-state solution is, what it means, what the creation of a Palestinian state is. What's also happening is that different countries are starting to define what is a two-state solution. When you create a Palestinian state, is a Palestinian state one that has a military, doesn't have a military? Do they have defined borders? Frankly, you look at Europe. Europe, right, in the olden days, when you look at what a country's sovereignty is, was you have the ability to make your own laws and you control your own borders. Europe is the EU is 27 countries. You have a European Parliament that makes their own laws that apply to everybody. Yet most Europeans aren't voting on those laws. It's really the laws are presented really by bureaucrats, not by people who are actually held accountable. And then when we talk about letting people into their borders, the reason why immigration is such a potent issue in European politics is because once a migrant gets into any European country, they are able to go into every country. So European countries' borders they don't have sovereignty over their own borders. So definitions of what a country is, sovereignty, military, even making your own laws and democracy, these things are not as black and white as I once had appeared. And that's something that different countries are now starting to get behind and are starting to understand. And even President Biden kind of basically repeated something that clearly he's heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu and probably Minister Dermer, this idea of a Palestinian state minus a state without the government, without a military, just leaving it very, very vague. But yes, Moshe, the main question, it is a problem. The two-state solution and the creation of a Palestinian state is a threat to the state of Israel. What the international community needs to move towards is, instead of advocating for a Palestinian state, we need to advocate for how do we resolve the conflict. And if we moved in that direction, how do we create peace, not how do we create a state, we'll be in a lot better situation. And IDSF has put out policy papers that describe many different kind of options and alternatives to the traditional two-state solution.
Let me ask just one more question before we go back to General Avivi. You mentioned many different issues impacting Europe in this war in Gaza. For our followers and viewers right now who are watching outside of North America, if they're to approach their representatives, whether they're in Europe or elsewhere, what would you say some of the top talking points are? Why any random country in Europe would be interested in supporting and siding with Israel?
So I would say the biggest answer, and frankly, I'm sure General Avivi could add to my answer, but the biggest answer is that if at the end of this war, Iran and those who are sympathetic to Iran, and on October 8th and the weeks thereafter, just about every single major European city had pro-Hamas rallies. That's something that should scare everybody, and I think it has scared many Europeans. If at the end of this war, Hamas is not destroyed, it's not completely dismantled, destroyed, and frankly humiliated. If Iran and their proxies and their supporters get the impression that the West doesn't have the stomach to fight back and to destroy them, Europe's days are numbered. And I think they really know that. And I think that actually is probably the bigger reason why Europeans are sticking by us a little bit more than usual. Plus, there are elections in the European Parliament in June. All 705 members of the European Parliament are up in June. And the expectation that this war is going to have an impact and the threat of additional Arab migrants is something that is going to be an issue, and it's probably going to lead to a much more stronger response, one that's more aligned with Israel, and we could see a post-June, July Europe that's moving more and more towards Israel. We've already seen in some of the elections that have taken place in Europe since October 7th that they have moved more and more in our direction. So there's optimism, but ultimately it's going to come to Israel itself saying, we need to do what is best for Israel and want to engage with our international partners, but we are not exclusively, we're not limited by what they can tolerate.
Thank you, Elie, for all you're doing. We're going to go back to General Avivi, please.
Yeah, thank you, Moshe. I think that looking at Europe, as Elie said, it's a lot about migration. They want a stabilized Middle East in order to prevent waves of migration. And we say the only way to stabilize the Middle East is being willing to pose a credible military threat, building a coalition, having an American-Israeli Sunni coalition, maybe also with Britain, France, some of NATO, to counter the Russian, Chinese, Iranian front that is endangering stability. And without doing that, at the end of the day, the Middle East will continue to destabilize, and then Europe will be threatened economically, and also it will be threatened with waves of migration that might impact every European, and not only Europeans. I think obviously it will impact also the US.
General, one question, because we do have a minute. All of the protests around the world, which Elie mentioned, do you think those were coordinated by Iran, by Hamas, or do you think that people just found the inspiration to side with them?
So I think there is a huge effort by Iran and by all this BDS movement that was built globally to incite. There is a lot of money. I mean, you see these demonstrations and you see people with signs, with flags. Somebody is funding this. It's not necessarily spontaneous. And there is a lot of money going into these rallies and demonstrations. And I think this is obviously scaring Jewish communities. It's creating anti-Semitism. But I think that talking about the war itself, Israel is more preoccupied on keeping the Biden administration aligned with the goals of war, keeping the flow of shipments of capabilities, munitions, everything we need, keeping the umbrella in the UN to enable us to continue and operate. And as we see, already more than 100 days, and basically we pretty much have an open check to do what we need to do to destroy Hamas. But the big question is really not Hamas, it's Hezbollah. What will happen in the north? And the only way to prevent war in the north is a strong coalition, is the willingness to really enforce Resolution 1701 on Hezbollah and get them to retreat from South Lebanon. Unfortunately, it's not easy. I'm not very, very optimistic that this will happen. I think that there is a good chance that we'll have to go to war with Hezbollah with all the consequences that this war might have. So we are looking at a long war where we to really achieve our goals.
Brigadier General Amir Avivi, Elie Pierpz, thank you so much for joining us today. To all of our viewers and supporters, thank you, of course, for joining us. We will be back with you again tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.